Hello everyone, my name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about After Apple Picking, written by Robert Frost. Now, before we talk about this poem, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment so that the channel can continue to grow. I'm about to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, so if you guys could help out by subscribing, that would be great. So, in this poem by Robert Frost, we see the narrator. He is a worker in this apple orchard, and the entire poem basically tells us what he did for the day and how hard his job is, and how in the poem the speaker he's anxious, he's worried, he's nervous because if you're a farmer, if you work with fruits and vegetables, and if you're just a farmer, there's a specific time for everything to be done when you work with food. And basically the narrator, he's kind of worried, he's kind of anxious while he's at home. Well, we assume that he's at home in the poem, and he's not picking apples anymore, and he's just trying to go to sleep. And throughout the poem he's kind of like, he's sometimes awake and sometimes he's asleep, so he's kind of jumping from being awake and from being asleep, and he's just kind of thinking about apples, thinking about all of the apples that he didn't pick, and how he didn't really clean up when he was done picking apples, because in the poem he tells us that he left his ladder in a tree and that there's barrels that are not filled completely, and there's apples here and there on trees that are still, just there on the trees, and there's so much work to be done, and all of the work wasn't done, and this narrator, he's just trying to get some sleep, but he can't get sleep. And the picture of this apple orchard that we get is this pretty much, it's not clean because he was working so hard he didn't have time to put his ladder away, to put his barrels of apples away. They had to be taken away quickly. He had to work fast. It was back-breaking work, and it was just a lot to do. So on the surface, this poem is literally, if you're just looking at it, if you're just reading it, it just sounds like the narrator is telling us about his day and how hard he worked to pick apples, and he didn't get to pick apples, and he's kind of anxious and worried because there's a good amount of time to pick apples, and once that time has passed, your apples might not be, they're not going to be in good condition. So that's how that's how the poem goes, or I guess you can say the story within the poem goes. Another thing that's very significant that the narrator talks about is how he talks about sleep a lot, and how he's just trying to get to sleep, and the length of sleep and different types of sleep. And this is very significant. So the poem just ends with him saying he needs sleep, and he's thinking about his sleep, and he's smelling apples, he's smelling the smells in his orchard, and he feels the work that he did throughout the day and how it's affecting his body, and how he's just jumping from being awake from being asleep. And that's pretty much the gist of the poem. That's pretty much what happens within the poem. In terms of analysis, there's a lot happening here. From on the surface level, you might just think that it's just a narrator, it's just a guy or a woman talking about his or her work during the day on this apple orchard. But there's some religious ideas within this poem. One thing you could go with, and there's enough evidence to prove this, is that the narrator talks about sleep a lot, and it's talking about heaven and hell, or dying, and where you go when you die. The poem kind of begins with like my pointed ladder, kind of like pointing towards heaven, pointing towards the sky, and that's like kind of from the Bible. Or there's a ladder in the Bible where angels come up and down, and the ladder is kind of like pointing towards heaven within the poem. So the narrator might be thinking about heaven, or maybe there's heavenly things to think about in the apple orchard. And the one thing I can compare to that is, if you think about an apple tree, the way that's being described, if the apples get picked and they don't get bruised and they don't get injured, and nothing happens to the apples and they're in perfect condition, they get sold and they make a profit. And if an apple is bruised, or it just looks bad, or it falls off the tree and it's just not physically pleasing, people are not going to buy it, and the farmer's not even going to waste time picking it and packing it. So that's probably going to go towards cider. So there's some evidence to say that the poem is kind of say the good apples kind of like they get chosen to go to heaven, and the bad apples just turn into cider. So you can play with nature in here and probably play with religion, because we kind of see the good apples get sold, the good apples go to a good place, and the bad apples just they get crushed, they get turned into cider, and that's just how it is. And so the way that the narrator is playing with sleep, talking about long sleep, short sleep, and where do you go when you take that long sleep. The way that the narrator is talking about what happens to the good apples and the bad apples, it kind of seems like there's enough evidence to prove that maybe the narrator is talking about heaven and hell, and what happens when you go there. And good people get good things, and bad people, bad apples get turned into cider and they get crushed. So that's one way you can look at the poem and interpret it. Certain people interpret it different ways, but that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at what the poem means, and what it can be analyzed, is just the role of nature, and how the narrator is kind of, he or she is very anxious, very worried about the time. There's always there's this there's time interval that is within the poem that the narrator wants to get done with apple picking. The narrator wants to finish picking apples in a certain amount of time, and the fact that he's going to sleep, he or she is going to sleep with apples still on the trees, it's it's nerve wracking, it's worrying, because he or she wanted to finish picking apples, even though that the poem is called After Apple Picking. The narrator is not done picking apples. And the reason why I keep saying he or she is because we don't really get a gender for the narrator within the poem. The narrator is just, very anxious, very worried, very stressed, because he or she can't get to sleep. He or she is trying to sleep and smelling apples for some reason, and just smelling the hard day of work that he or she went through, and just there's just so many things in within the poem about what apple picking can be. And another thing to draw upon is the title. So the title of the poem says After Apple Picking. It says after apple picking, but again, are you really done picking apples? Because since you're at home and you're trying to sleep, but you can't sleep, you're just thinking about the apples that weren't picked, and you're thinking about the apples that were left in barrels, and you're thinking about this hard day of work. Is the narrator really done picking apples? Is the narrator's work done? So maybe the narrator never finished picking apples. So is it really after apple picking? Because even though that we're assuming that the narrator's at home, and he or she's trying to get sleep, there's still a lot of work to be done. So there's different ways to look at the poem, and then there's enough evidence to prove different meanings towards this poem. But that's the main gist of it. That's what is going on within this poem. So that's my summary and analysis of After Apple Picking by Robert Frost. Please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment, and I'll see you guys in the next video.